So in this last chapter for the second part of this course, we want to focus on a more realistic form of industrial organization. In the last chapter, we looked at perfect competition, which was an unrealistic, highly idealized situation. It was unrealistic primarily because of two things. First, every firm made an exactly identical product, and that then because of that, another consequence of that was that there was no barriers to entry or exit. So firms were coming and going as they pleased, and each firm faced a perfectly elastic demand curve because each firm produced exactly the same thing. So they all had to charge the same price. Now, something that's actually much more realistic, in fact it's going to be the most dominant type of industrial competition that we have, is what we deal with in Chapter 12, Monopolistic Competition. In monopolistic competition, each firm faces some pricing power. Now you'll remember from perfect competition that there was no pricing power. Each firm produced exactly the same product, right? And as a result of that, on a firm level, the demand curve was perfectly horizontal. Each firm producing the exact same product. I think we used corn as our example here. So each firm selling corn had to charge the same price, but if they charged the market price, they could sell as much as they wanted. This demand curve was equal to price and was equal to marginal revenue. Now, in the case of monopolistic competition, each firm has some pricing power. There are still many buyers and sellers, but now they don't sell exactly the same product. Rather, they sell a similar product with some differences between within the product that's being sold. And there's still easy entry and exit. But what we're going to see here is that from the firm's perspective, each individual firm, because each product is slightly differentiated and in some sense unique, what we mean by this is something like, here we go, my tape, right? You can buy tape from several different companies, right? And you could be called adhesive, whatever, right? This is Scotch brand tape. So Scotch brand tape has that kind of like weird feel to the top of it. It's kind of like that scratchy feel to the top of it, right? And it's got that plaid design that defines it as being, here we go, right? And it's got that plaid design that defines it as Scotch tape. Now, right, you could also buy like the Staples brand, which would also be adhesive tape, right, and would have different characteristics, right? But this one, right, even though the Staples brand of tape and the 3M Scotch brand of tape do pretty much the same thing, this one is advertised as having a matte finish and called magic tape. Whatever that difference is, that would then be up to marketers and whatnot to emphasize the differences that they have. But each firm, right, so let's call this the 3M Scotch tape, then faces a downward sloping demand curve, right? Because if 3M charges a really high price, not too many people are going to buy it. Now, for this demand curve, it equals price, but it no longer equals the marginal revenue. In fact, the marginal revenue is now going to be less than the price. And the reason why this is going to be the case is because marginal revenue, if you remember, is the change in total revenue over the change in quantity. But look at what happens here along this demand curve. Is you'll notice that the elasticity is changing, right? We know that from chapter, 6? We know that the elasticity is changing along this demand curve, which means that as we change the demand, in terms of total revenue, which is P times Q, how much changing the price changes the quantity, which is something defined by the elasticity, is going to define the shape of that marginal revenue curve. It'll always be steeper than the demand curve. Monopolistically competitive firms are price searchers rather than price takers. Because what they're going to do is they're still going to follow the same rule of profit maximization, which is marginal revenue equaling marginal cost. But now we go up to the demand curve to find the price. Here's my quantity I'm going to sell. Here's the price I'm going to charge. These monopolistically competitive firms are price searchers. Now, does this firm earn a profit or not? Well, that's going to depend on where the average total cost curve is relative to all of this. Let's just clean this up a little bit here. In this case, I have the firm earning zero profit. More specifically, we set MR equal to MC to find the quantity, and then I go up to the demand curve to find the price. This whole region would now be my total revenue. Now, what would the cost be? I would have to take that quantity and go up to the ATC curve. And I made it specifically so that it was just touching here. This would be scenario 1, where profit is equal to 0. Now, one thing to take note of is that it's not at the lowest point of the ATC curve, because in fact you know that mathematically speaking, ATC is at its lowest point when it intersects the MC curve. So if I'd drawn this accurately, that would be something like right there. This is what's known as the excess capacity theorem. This fact that the firm isn't producing way out here. Firms face no incentive to produce where average total costs are lowest, unlike the perfectly competitive firm. And so what that means for us then is that they, because they're producing less than the maximum, they're going to underutilize their capacity. They're going to have a production plant that's not producing at 100% capacity. And as a consequence of that, you could then see it as having some wasted resources. But the firm faces no incentive to produce that much, because at that point they would then be producing, right? They would start to be approaching the point where changing the price has very little change on the quantity, right? The inelastic region. And they don't want to be operating at that point, because at that point then their total revenue is going to suffer. If they try to lower the price in an effort to get more customers, customers are not going to be responding to that. Now, what if instead of having zero profit, we drew a situation like this? What would we do? MR equals MC to find the quantity, the profit maximizing quantity for this perfectly competitive firm. Up to the demand curve to find the price. Here's my revenue. Now what's the cost? It's way up here. Right, that rectangle for total cost is much larger. This firm's going to be at a loss. It's not going to be making money here. And in the long run, what is that going to mean? It's going to mean that firms are going to have to exit the marketplace. Now, what would that mean if firms are then exiting the marketplace? That means that each surviving firm is now going to capture a larger share of the market. Hey, when that happens, if each existing firm is capturing a larger share of the market, that's going to start shifting the demand curve out. And it's going to keep doing that until it just touches the ATC curve. The opposite situation would be where it's earning a profit. Something like this. MR equal to MC. Find my Q. Up to the demand curve to find the price. Here's my total revenue. My costs go to right here. This firm is now earning a profit as defined by this region right here. What that would mean is that firms are now going to enter this marketplace, and firms, as they enter the marketplace, means that each existing firm is now going to have a smaller share of the market, which is going to draw that inwards until it just touches the ATC curve again. So you'll see here, just like in case of perfect competition, here's the kind of the takeaway point, is that free entry and exit, that's the competitive part of monopolistically competitive. The free entry and exit ensures that just like perfectly competitive firms, that the long run profit situation is such that they earn zero profit. The monopolistically competitive part of monopolistic competition is the fact that the marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve. Now again, this is one that is an important type of firm structure to understand. Unfortunately, it's usually one of the shorter chapters in a Principles of Microeconomics course like this one, but it is the most realistic of them. And so you'd look very fancy and economically if you were to come out to a potential employer and whatnot and talk about them being monopolistically competitive, if in fact they were. Okay, this is the last chapter, a very short chapter, fortunately for you, before the second exam. So I'll be making a final video that will be going over what you need to study for the final exam.